The sun had barely begun its ascent, yet the Nevada desert already shimmered with an almost painful intensity, a relentless golden glare bouncing off the rocky outcrops and dust-choked ground. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her eyes scanning the horizon. She crouched beside Corporal Diaz, a young soldier who had taken a heavy hit to his left shoulder during a simulated training exercise gone unexpectedly brutal. Sarah's hands moved instinctively, precise and confident as she tore open her medical kit. The metallic smell of antiseptic mingled with the dusty desert air, a faint scent of tension and fear that seemed to hang over the canyon. Each movement was deliberate. Every second counted. Diaz groaned, his face contorted in pain. I can't feel my arm," he stammered. "You will," Sarah said firmly, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "Stay with me, Corporal. I've got you." She applied the tourniquet with practiced speed, her fingers steady despite the racing of her heart. Then came the sound, boots striking the hard earth. Heavy, authoritative, measured. General Thomas Hargrove appeared over the ridge, his polished uniform almost blinding in the harsh morning sun. Sarah's eyes narrowed instinctively. She knew that glare. She had seen it in briefings, in training logs, in the way soldiers spoke about him in hushed tones. The man had a reputation for cruelty wrapped in authority. "Step aside, medic," Hargrove barked, his voice cutting through the desert silence like a blade. There was no patience, no room for negotiation. The general's presence carried a weight that could make seasoned officers hesitate, but Sarah did not flinch. "I'm treating a wounded soldier," she said, her voice steady. "You don't interfere with medical procedures." Hargrove's lips curled into a sneer. "I am the general, I am your procedure." Before she could react further, he drew his revolver with shocking speed. The metallic click seemed almost theatrical against the soft cries of the injured soldiers around them. 5 shots rang out, each one a thunderclap in the desert's empty expanse. Sand exploded around Sarah as she dove behind a jagged rock, the hot metal of the bullets searing the air inches from her face. Time slowed. She felt the vibration of the shots in her chest. Her training kicked in, not the military drills, but the quiet, controlled instincts that came from countless hours in trauma simulations and battlefield care. Sarah's mind raced. He's testing me. He wants to break me. He thinks I'll run. But she didn't. Instead, she assessed her options. The desert offered little cover, but the rocks were jagged enough to shield her from direct fire. Her eyes scanned the terrain, noting the canyon walls, the scattered debris from the exercise vehicles, even the small desert shrubs that could be leveraged for concealment. Hargrove's boots struck the ground closer, his figure looming over the soldiers. He barked orders at the others, his tone a mixture of command and threat, but none moved. His reputation had built a wall of fear. And yet here she was, the medic, crouched low, staring back at him unflinchingly. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands gripping her medical kit, her mind already calculating. She didn't just need to survive, she needed to protect Diaz and herself. And she had a plan. She spotted a flare tucked into her kit. Normally, she would reserve it for signaling medevac in emergencies, but this was no ordinary emergency. It was a direct threat from a man armed with authority and a gun. She grabbed the flare, striking it against the rough edge of the kit, sending a burst of red light and sparks into the air. The flare ignited the canyon wall behind Hargrove, sending smoke curling upward in thick tendrils. Hargrove staggered back instinctively, shielding his eyes from the sudden blaze. His mouth opened in a yell that was swallowed by the flare's harsh light. Sarah took this instant, heart hammering, legs coiled like springs, and sprang from her cover, moving with a speed and precision that belied her size. She reached the edge of the rock formation, assessing her next move. The general was still dazed, fumbling with his revolver as if the desert itself had betrayed him. Sarah realized something crucial. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about turning the tables. From her kit she pulled a tactical stun device, a tool meant to subdue wild animals in rescue operations, repurposed for the field. Her fingers wrapped around it, a surge of adrenaline sharpening her movements. She aimed at Hargrove's feet and pressed the trigger. A burst of electric energy erupted, the crackling sound louder than the gunshots had been. Hargrove screamed, his body convulsing, the gun clattering to the sand. The desert fell silent. Soldiers peeked from behind rocks and vehicles, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, awe, and fear. The general, untouchable, feared, arrogant, lay on the ground, stunned and vulnerable. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the revolver, her hands steady, her breaths controlled. She had never intended to shoot anyone, but the desert had shifted its rules in the span of a few seconds. The power dynamic had changed. She was no longer just a medic. She was the arbiter of what happened next. Hargrove's eyes opened, wide and wild with fury, as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. "You dare!" he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, a mixture of rage and disbelief. Sarah's voice cut through the tension, low, calm, unyielding. "You fired at me. You tried to kill me. And now you answer to me." For a heartbeat, the desert held its breath. The wind stirred dust around them, painting the scene in streaks of orange and gold. Sarah's chest heaved, not from fear but from the intensity of the moment. She knew the world could change in an instant, that authority could crumble before courage, and that the smallest actions could become legend. Somewhere in the distance, the canyon seemed to hum, as if the desert itself was acknowledging the improbable. One woman standing, alive, unbroken, facing down a general. Sarah looked down at Diaz, still weak but conscious. "I've got you," she whispered, and in that whisper was not just reassurance but defiance. The desert was a battlefield and she had already begun to win. The flare's smoke curled into the sky, a crimson serpent twisting through the desert dawn. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn's chest heaved, each breath a battle between adrenaline and controlled focus. Corporal Diaz clutched his arm, groaning softly, but alive. Sarah kept her hand pressed against his wound, using the tourniquet to stem the bleeding. General Thomas Hargrove lay sprawled on the sand, the stun device's residual sparks dancing over his uniform. He struggled to rise, his movements jagged and uncoordinated, but his eyes, ice-cold and burning with disbelief, never left Sarah. "You medic, you dare," he rasped. The words, though clipped, carried the weight of decades of unquestioned power. Sarah's gaze did not waver. Every second counted. The soldiers around them were frozen, unsure whether to intervene or obey the broken chain of command unraveling before their eyes. Hargrove's men had been trained to follow orders without hesitation. Now they faced a choice they never expected: defy their general or witness him humiliated, possibly harmed by a medic half his size. Sarah crouched behind a jagged rock, the revolver still in her hand, the flare's red glow illuminating her determined face. Her mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. She knew she couldn't simply wait for reinforcements. Hargrove had authority, influence, and ruthlessness. He could escape, manipulate, or worse, retaliate. "You think this is over?" Hargrove finally snarled, his voice regaining some composure. "You will regret this, Lieutenant. You are nothing without the chain of command." Sarah's fingers tightened around the revolver, but her voice remained calm, controlled, deliberate. "You fired at me. 5 shots. That's not chain of command, General. That's attempted murder." He laughed, a sound devoid of humor, like metal grinding against stone. "Murder? You overestimate your importance. Medics save lives, yes, but they do not dictate orders to generals." For a heartbeat, Sarah's entire world seemed to shrink into that canyon, the flare smoke curling like a living thing, blurring the desert horizon. And in that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her medical kit and pulled out a small tactical flare gun, reserved for signaling medevac helicopters during training exercises. Her hands were steady, almost eerily so, as she loaded the device. Hargrove's eyes followed every movement, the realization dawning on him too late. Sarah fired the flare, not at him, but at the rocky canyon wall behind him. The flare struck with a sharp crack, igniting a sudden burst of sparks and smoke. The canyon reflected the bright red light, casting jagged shadows that danced across Hargrove's furious face. His hands flew up to shield his eyes. In that split second, Sarah moved. Her legs propelled her forward in a controlled sprint, weaving through the sparse desert cover with fluid precision. Hargrove's attention was momentarily diverted, his reflexes compromised by the flare's unexpected brilliance. Sarah's training wasn't limited to medicine. She had studied battlefield movements, evasive maneuvers, and survival tactics. Years of drills, simulations, and on-the-job improvisation had sharpened her reflexes to razor-edge precision. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat counted. She reached the general, still dazed, fumbling for his revolver that had fallen to the sand. Without hesitation, she activated the tactical stun device again, aiming for the ground near his feet. The electricity surged in a violent arc, and Hargrove screamed, stumbling backward, his hands flailing as the device's shock paralyzed his movements for crucial seconds. Soldiers watched, mouths agape. The untouchable general was vulnerable. The invincible Hargrove, whose name carried fear across bases and training grounds alike, was struggling like a child under Sarah's controlled assault. Sarah didn't feel exhilaration. This wasn't about victory yet. This was survival, yes, but more than that, it was about protecting lives. Diaz's life, hers, and the invisible line between duty and tyranny that Hargrove had crossed when he had fired those 5 shots. As Hargrove collapsed backward onto the sand, Sarah approached carefully, her revolver pointed, ready to act if necessary. Her mind was a whirlwind of options: restrain him, subdue him, or wait for backup. Every instinct screamed that he was dangerous, even incapacitated. He had power, cunning, and a team that could mobilize against her in minutes. "You underestimate me," Hargrove spat through gritted teeth, pain and fury intermingling in his voice. "You cannot." Sarah ignored him. Instead, she focused on the soldiers who had frozen at the edges of the scene. They looked torn, trained to obey, yet witnessing something impossible. A medic defying a general was unthinkable, yet here it was. She spoke loudly, clearly, so everyone could hear. "He tried to kill me, and now he's going to answer for it. Anyone who interferes will face the same consequences." For a moment, silence dominated the canyon. The wind whispered over the rocks, carrying dust and tension like a tangible fog. Then one soldier shifted, uneasily, eyes darting from Hargrove to Sarah. Another followed. Slowly, the others began to realize that the dynamic had shifted. The authority they had once feared had been stripped away in moments of sheer courage and strategy. Hargrove struggled to rise, rage and confusion etched into his features. "This isn't over," he yelled, but his voice lacked the commanding force it had once carried. Sarah saw the first cracks in his armor. The arrogance that had always made him untouchable now revealed as vulnerability. Sarah took a measured step closer, keeping Diaz safely behind a nearby rock. She lowered her voice, though each word carried weight. "It is over the moment you tried to kill someone sworn to save lives. You crossed a line, General, and now you're going to learn what accountability looks like." Hargrove's breathing grew heavier. He tried to shout again, but Sarah's calm, unwavering gaze pinned him in place. He realized that brute force, which had always secured obedience, would not work here, not against her. Suddenly, a new sound punctuated the tense desert silence, the soft hum of a drone engine. Sarah's eyes flicked to the sky. A surveillance drone, likely part of routine training oversight, hovered above, its camera catching every movement. A voice crackled faintly through the device's speaker, though unintelligible at first. It was a reminder: witnesses were everywhere, and this confrontation would not remain secret. Sarah's mind worked fast. She needed to secure evidence, ensure Hargrove could not manipulate the narrative, and protect everyone in the canyon. But she also needed to maintain the moral high ground. No one could claim she had acted with lethal intent. Her actions had to be decisive, precise, and defensible. She crouched, surveying the canyon. The flare still burned red, painting the jagged rocks with ominous streaks. The sand around her was scorched in places by the gunfire, but more importantly, every shadow seemed to whisper opportunity. Sarah realized that while Hargrove had underestimated her, she could leverage every second of the chaos to regain control. And that's when she made her next move, a risky gamble, the kind that required nerve, precision, and perfect timing. Her hand moved toward her kit again, retrieving tools that were never meant for confrontation, tools meant for healing and rescue. Yet today, they would serve another purpose: survival, protection, and justice. Sarah's gaze locked on Hargrove. Every soldier in the canyon was watching. The desert wind whipped dust into their faces, the flare's red light casting dramatic shadows. Sarah's heart pounded, but her mind was clear. One wrong move and the general could recover, shoot, or manipulate the situation. One right move and she could change the course of events forever. Her fingers curled around the first tool she would use, an instrument of precision, electricity, and controlled force. She activated it, ready to strike again if necessary, but also ready to pivot, adapt, and survive. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the sun climbing higher, its harsh rays illuminating a battlefield unlike any in the military manuals. Here, courage and skill were the only weapons that mattered. The desert seemed to pulse with tension, every grain of sand vibrating under the weight of what had just transpired. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn's breath came in controlled bursts, her chest heaving, but her eyes remained sharp, scanning the terrain. General Thomas Hargrove struggled beneath the stun device's residual hum, his uniform disheveled, his once imposing posture reduced to a scrambling, uncoordinated heap. Sarah knew one thing: she had mere seconds before he regained full strength. The general's reputation wasn't just built on fear, it was built on cunning. And though he had underestimated her, she could not underestimate him now. Her hand tightened around the revolver she had recovered, but she didn't raise it yet. She didn't need to. Hargrove's arrogance was still his weakness. He struggled to rise, the desert sun glinting off the sweat on his brow, his eyes darting, wild with fury and disbelief. "You medic," he gasped, his voice cracking. "You think this changes anything? I am a general. You will regret this." Sarah stepped closer, the flare's red glow illuminating her determined face, casting long, jagged shadows on the sand. Her movements were precise, calculated like a dancer on a battlefield. She didn't panic. She didn't hesitate. She simply acted. From her medical kit, she pulled a set of heavy-duty zip ties, normally used for securing equipment in the field. They were her improvisation weapon, her tool of restraint. Hargrove's eyes widened as she approached, each step deliberate. He tried to lunge, but the stun device's shock had sapped his initial strength, leaving him vulnerable. "You will not harm anyone else," Sarah said firmly, her voice echoing across the canyon. She moved with speed and precision, binding his hands behind his back. The general thrashed, shouting obscenities, but she remained calm, each motion practiced, deliberate, and authoritative. Around them, the soldiers watched in stunned silence. No one had ever seen a medic, especially a young lieutenant, take control of a general in this way. The sheer audacity of the act stunned them. Fear and admiration warred across their faces. Hargrove's face contorted with rage. You have no idea who you're dealing with," he spat, his voice raw with anger. "I've commanded battalions, led wars." "You commanded fear," Sarah interrupted, "not respect. You fired at me. You endangered lives. That ends now." The general attempted to kick, to push, to escape, but Sarah maintained her balance, shifting her weight and leveraging the rocky terrain to keep him restrained. Her tactical training, combined with her medical precision, allowed her to anticipate his movements, countering each lunge with a calculated adjustment. Suddenly, the drone overhead hummed louder, circling, capturing every motion in high definition. Its camera zoomed in, recording not just Hargrove's rage but Sarah's calm, composed defiance. Her mind raced. This footage could serve as irrefutable proof of his actions. But more importantly, it was a safeguard. A general without accountability could manipulate events, twist narratives, or retaliate. This recording was her insurance. "You will answer for your actions," Sarah said, kneeling slightly to ensure Hargrove could not rise. "And the world will see them for what they are." The general's face turned red with fury, a mask of arrogance cracking under the weight of reality. He struggled, attempting to twist his body, but the zip ties held. The desert wind whipped sand into their eyes, stinging, but Sarah remained focused, every movement precise, her breathing controlled. She glanced at Diaz, who had watched in a mix of fear and awe. His arm was stabilized, but he was still weak. "Stay down," Sarah whispered, nodding toward him. "I've got this." Then a new threat emerged. From the ridge above, one of Hargrove's officers stepped forward, his rifle trained on the scene. "Lieutenant Quinn, step away from the general," he ordered, his voice trembling between authority and disbelief. Sarah didn't flinch. She raised her hand slowly, the revolver lowered but visible. "Do not interfere," she said, her tone carrying an unshakable certainty. "He fired at me first. You saw it. The general is restrained. Any attempt to escalate this will be recorded." The officer hesitated, glancing between the bound general and the unyielding medic. The desert sun caught the sweat on his brow. For the first time, he questioned the chain of command he had followed blindly for years. Hargrove's voice rose again, a furious roar. "You cannot, I will destroy you." Sarah ignored him, focusing instead on her next tactical move. She retrieved a small, portable radio from her kit and activated it, contacting the base. Her voice was calm, professional, but laced with urgency. "Command, this is Lieutenant Quinn. I need immediate authorization to secure General Hargrove. He attempted lethal force against personnel under my care. Repeat, Hargrove fired on a medic, requesting immediate backup and investigative authority." Static hissed, then a voice crackled back, confused but authoritative. "Lieutenant, repeat your status. Are you secure?" "I am secure. General Hargrove is restrained. Soldiers in the area are witnesses. Backup requested immediately. Situation stable but volatile. Require containment and documentation." As she spoke, Hargrove continued to struggle, but his energy was waning. The combination of shock, humiliation, and the flare's lingering heat had sapped his strength. His eyes, once a piercing steel, now flickered with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and grudging respect. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew the next moments would define everything. If she faltered, Hargrove could recover and unleash chaos. But if she maintained composure, used the environment, and relied on her training, she could secure not only her own safety but also the accountability of a man who had long believed himself untouchable. She looked at the drone's camera feed. The device hovered, circling, capturing every detail. The flare-lit canyon, the dust swirling around Hargrove, the resolute calm of the medic, and the wide-eyed soldiers who witnessed history in real time. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself a flicker of satisfaction. She had turned the tide. The general, the embodiment of arrogance and power, was now powerless, but she did not celebrate. There was work to do: documentation, containment, ensuring the safety of everyone present. Suddenly, Hargrove's voice broke through her focus, a harsh rasp filled with venom. "You think this proves anything? You are nothing." Sarah's gaze met his, unwavering. "The proof is in the evidence, General, and in the fact that you are restrained. The next step is up to the authorities." The flare's glow reflected off the canyon walls, casting both figures in dramatic relief. The medic, resolute and composed, and the general, furious and humiliated. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable, every soldier aware that they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years. And then from the shadows, a young specialist emerged, phone in hand, quietly recording the entire scene. Specialist Rivera, a soldier who had admired Sarah for years, understood the significance of the moment. Every detail captured could serve as irrefutable evidence. Every movement, every word, every action would now live beyond the desert, beyond the confines of the military base, beyond the reach of Hargrove's influence. Sarah's mind raced. She had stabilized Diaz, restrained Hargrove, and secured witnesses. The next move would be critical. She had to ensure that the general's authority could not undo what she had accomplished, that the narrative of attempted murder and recklessness could not be rewritten. Her eyes scanned the horizon. Backup would arrive soon, and the desert's vast expanse ensured no one could escape unnoticed. But Sarah knew this battle wasn't over yet. The general's arrogance had not vanished, it had merely been contained, and he would fight, through influence, manipulation, or sheer will, against the accountability she now wielded. For now, though, she stood tall, a calm eye in a storm of chaos. The desert wind whipped her hair, dust stung her eyes, but she remained focused, resolute. The general was restrained, the evidence captured, and her soldiers watching with awe. The desert sun climbed higher, beating down on the jagged canyon floor like an unforgiving judge. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn crouched, her boots kicking up fine dust as she adjusted her grip on the revolver. General Thomas Hargrove, bound by the zip ties Sarah had expertly applied, lay sprawled on the sand, his chest heaving, chestnut-colored eyes flashing with a mix of fury, disbelief, and humiliation. The canyon, once silent save for the cries of wounded soldiers, now hummed with tension. The smoke from the flare curled toward the bright blue sky, casting eerie shadows that seemed to make the rocks lean closer, as if the desert itself were watching the confrontation. Sarah's mind raced. Every second counted. Hargrove had power, influence, and a network of loyalists who could strike in an instant. But for now, he was vulnerable. "You will regret this," Hargrove spat, his voice cracking. "You have no idea who I am, no idea what I can do." Sarah stepped closer, deliberately calm, the revolver pointed but not threateningly raised. She needed him conscious, alive, but restrained, and above all, aware that his arrogance had met its match. "You shot at me," she said steadily. 5 times attempted murder, and now you're accountable." Hargrove's laugh was hollow, desperate. "Accountable? You think a medic can dictate consequences for a general? You're nothing." "I'm something," Sarah said quietly, almost to herself. "And today I'm in control." She adjusted her stance, keeping her weight low and her feet planted firmly on the sand. Her eyes scanned the horizon and the scattered soldiers who were now slowly emerging from cover, faces wide-eyed, disbelief written across every expression. The soldiers' hesitation was critical. No one wanted to intervene against Hargrove, yet no one could ignore the fact that he had been overpowered by a single medic. Sarah's actions had rewritten the rules of engagement in the canyon. Suddenly, Hargrove's eyes darted toward the ridge. A few of his loyal officers were advancing, rifles raised, unsure how to respond. Sarah anticipated this, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the nearest rock outcropping. She motioned with her free hand toward Diaz, who had stabilized somewhat but remained weak. "Stay low," she whispered. Then she addressed the approaching officers loudly, her voice carrying across the canyon floor. "Step back. He fired at me. He endangered lives. Any interference will be recorded." The lead officer hesitated, scanning Hargrove and then Sarah. Doubt flickered across his face. He knew Hargrove's reputation, the consequences of disobedience, but he also saw the medic, resolute, composed, and in control. The canyon seemed to shift under the weight of her authority. Hargrove groaned and twisted, the zip ties cutting into his wrists as he fought against them. His desperation grew, but Sarah didn't flinch. She leaned closer, her gaze locked on his. "You wanted control, General," she said quietly, deliberately letting each word sink in. "Now you have none, and you're going to learn what accountability means." He spat into the sand, his chest heaving. "You cannot, I am untouchable." "You are touchable," Sarah replied evenly, "because you tried to take a life, and the desert doesn't forget. Neither does anyone who witnessed this." She glanced at the soldiers again, nodding their silent compliance, their eyes wide with awe and disbelief. Every second they hesitated was a testament to her resolve and his diminishing authority. The drone overhead hovered silently, circling, capturing every moment. Its lens focused on the red flare-lit canyon floor, on the bound general, on Sarah's unwavering stance. She knew this was her insurance, undeniable proof that Hargrove had acted recklessly, violently, and without authority. Hargrove's breathing became erratic. His attempts to lunge and fight were weakening. The humiliation of being overpowered by someone he deemed insignificant, someone he considered beneath his notice, was gnawing at him, eroding the arrogance that had made him untouchable for decades. Sarah shifted her stance again, circling slightly to keep him in her field of vision. Her movements were calm, deliberate, almost predatory in their precision. She had trained for battlefield triage, yes, but her instincts for survival and control were honed equally sharply. This was a standoff, a psychological duel as much as a physical one. The soldiers around them murmured among themselves, the tension thickening the air like smoke from the flare. Some whispered Sarah's name, others questioned orders, but none moved against her. She had become the pivot point of authority, and Hargrove's men could feel the balance tipping. "You think this proves something?" Hargrove rasped, his face flushed, sweat and sand sticking to his skin. "This is temporary, you'll see." "Temporary?" Sarah echoed, her voice calm, icy. "You think it's temporary because you are used to controlling the narrative, but the truth isn't temporary. You tried to kill a medic. That truth stays." For a brief moment, Hargrove froze, caught between rage and realization. His lips trembled. He had spent decades cultivating fear, commanding obedience, creating an aura of untouchability. And now, all of it had crumbled under the weight of one woman's courage and ingenuity. From the ridge above, the remaining loyal officers hesitated, unsure whether to follow the general's orders or respect the unprecedented scene unfolding below. The canyon's silence was palpable, every footstep and gust of wind amplified in the tense air. Sarah's voice cut through it, steady, commanding. "Do nothing rash. The situation is under control. Any action against me will be considered assault." Hargrove thrashed again, weaker now, the zip ties biting into his wrists, his fury barely contained. But Sarah didn't falter. She had assessed every risk: the flare, the stun device, the revolver, the drone overhead, and the soldier's presence. She had created a perfect containment scenario, turning the desert into her advantage. Her eyes flicked to Diaz. The corporal's breathing was steady now, though he was still pale and weak. She gave him a small nod, reassurance in the silence. Diaz's survival had been her first priority, and now she had to secure the second, containment of the general until authority arrived. And then, without warning, Hargrove made his move, a desperate, reckless twist, throwing himself backward in an attempt to disarm Sarah or escape the canyon. She anticipated it instantly, pivoting her body, keeping him restrained while maintaining leverage. The general's momentum carried him into a small sand dune, the impact rattling his spine, but Sarah was unwavering. "You are done here," she said quietly, almost cruel in its calm. "This is the moment you learn that rank doesn't excuse murder." Hargrove's face contorted with a mix of pain and rage. The realization hit him fully. He was defeated, restrained, and recorded. The canyon, witness to decades of military power, had seen its first reversal. The drone circled lower, capturing the close-up of his humiliation and her composed authority. Sarah knew that this footage, combined with her meticulous documentation, would make any attempt at rewriting the events impossible. From a distance, the wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint cries of the injured soldiers. Sarah remained calm, her mind racing, calculating the next steps. She needed backup, confirmation, and containment. But most importantly, she needed Hargrove alive and accountable. The general, for all his arrogance, realized he was trapped not just physically but strategically. Every move he might have made to reclaim power was now impossible. The desert had shifted the rules, and Sarah Quinn had rewritten them entirely. The desert sun blazed overhead, unforgiving and relentless, yet Lieutenant Sarah Quinn remained steady, a figure of calm authority amid the chaos. General Thomas Hargrove, bound and humiliated, thrashed against the zip ties, his fury barely contained. Each attempted movement only confirmed his vulnerability, and Sarah watched, calculating her next step. The canyon had become a battlefield not of bullets alone, but of strategy, courage, and cunning. "Enough," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the canyon floor. "You've had your chance, now it's over." Hargrove spat onto the sand, the gesture almost theatrical in its fury. "You think this ends here, medic?" he growled, his chest heaving. "Do you realize who I am? I am untouchable." Sarah's gaze remained steady. She had learned early in her career that arrogance often revealed weakness. The more Hargrove shouted, the more he exposed himself. "Untouchable," she said quietly. "Maybe, until someone shows you that actions have consequences." Her hands moved with precision, pulling a second set of zip ties from her kit. She approached the general, now tiring from his struggles, and quickly restrained his legs. The combination of upper and lower bindings left Hargrove immobilized, the once powerful man reduced to a figure of helpless rage. Around them, the soldiers who had initially frozen began to stir, murmuring among themselves. Some whispered Sarah's name in awe. Others exchanged glances, realizing that the chain of command had fractured in a way they had never witnessed before. Sarah, a medic, had seized control of a man whose authority had dominated their lives for years. "You've done it," muttered Diaz, the young corporal Sarah had saved, his arm now stabilized. His voice trembled slightly, a mix of relief and disbelief. You restrained him." Sarah gave him a brief nod, acknowledging his recovery without taking her eyes off the general. "I've got him," she said firmly. "Now we ensure everyone's safety." Hargrove's face contorted with rage, his chest heaving. He attempted a desperate kick, striking the sand with enough force to scatter dust and small stones, but Sarah anticipated it, shifting her stance and keeping him firmly restrained. The desert had become a chessboard, and she was thinking 3 moves ahead. Her gaze flicked to the drone hovering overhead, circling to capture every angle. The footage was her insurance, proof of Hargrove's recklessness, his attempt on her life, and her calm, professional response. She knew this would be vital not just for her protection, but to ensure that the general could be held accountable. Then came a crucial moment. A young specialist emerged from the shadows of a nearby ridge, phone in hand, filming the entire scene. Specialist Marco Rivera had admired Sarah for years, and he understood the gravity of what was happening. Every action, every word, every flash of emotion was being recorded in high definition. Sarah allowed herself a flicker of satisfaction. She wasn't alone. There were witnesses, both human and mechanical, ensuring that the truth could not be rewritten. Hargrove, despite his arrogance and power, could not escape this moment. From behind the rocks, Hargrove's remaining loyalists hesitated. Their rifles were raised, but their hands wavered. Orders had always been absolute, but here in the canyon they faced an impossible dilemma. Obey the general who had fired on a medic, or respect the medic who now held indisputable control. Sarah addressed them clearly, her voice carrying across the canyon. "Do nothing. This is contained. Any interference will be documented." Her words hung in the air like an unbreakable shield. Slowly, cautiously, the soldiers lowered their weapons, uncertainty and awe etched into their faces. The general's aura of absolute authority was cracking, replaced by a new reality. He was accountable and she was in control. Hargrove's face reddened with fury. "You are nothing, do you hear me? Nothing," he screamed. "You are finished," Sarah replied evenly, "and it begins with accountability." She crouched slightly, moving with the precision of a seasoned operative, and pulled the revolver from her belt. Her finger hovered near the trigger, but she did not aim at him. This was not about vengeance. This was about leverage, control, and survival. She had no intention of firing. Her goal was clear: containment, evidence, and ensuring that Hargrove could not manipulate the situation once backup arrived. Suddenly, Hargrove attempted a desperate maneuver. He twisted violently, attempting to roll over, but Sarah anticipated it. Using her body weight strategically, she pinned him down, ensuring he could not escape or strike. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured. "Think carefully, General," she said quietly, her voice low but carrying weight. "One more reckless act and there will be consequences beyond your imagination. You've already crossed the line." The general thrashed weakly, the fight draining from him as he realized the futility of resistance. His arrogance had blinded him to one truth: a person with courage, skill, and composure could dismantle the power of someone who relied solely on intimidation. Sarah's eyes scanned the canyon again, noting the positions of soldiers, the angle of the sun, and the drifting smoke from the flare. Every detail mattered. She was constructing a perfect containment scenario, leaving no room for Hargrove to regain control or manipulate the narrative. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached for her radio. Her voice was professional, precise, and unyielding. "Command, this is Lieutenant Quinn. Situation contained. General Hargrove is restrained. Multiple witnesses present. Drone footage capturing all movements. Immediate investigative team requested. I repeat, immediate containment and documentation required." Static hissed, then a voice crackled back, tinged with disbelief. "Lieutenant, are you certain? General Hargrove restrained." "I am certain," Sarah replied. "He attempted lethal force. Evidence is recorded. Backup and containment required immediately." As she spoke, Hargrove's breathing grew heavier, his face slick with sweat and dust. The realization of his predicament sank in. The man who had dominated and intimidated for decades was now at the mercy of the very medic he had once dismissed. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the flare's red glow reflecting off the jagged rocks, casting long, dramatic shadows. Sarah's figure was resolute, unyielding, a calm eye in the storm of chaos. And then, in a moment of calculated decisiveness, she retrieved the stun device again, placing it near Hargrove's legs. A quick burst of electricity ensured compliance without causing permanent harm. The general screamed, convulsing briefly before lying still, exhausted and restrained. "Stay down," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying authority beyond her rank. "Compliance is the only way to survive this moment." The surrounding soldiers watched, some in awe, others in fear. No one had ever seen this. A medic had taken control, restrained a general, and held absolute command over the situation. It was unprecedented and it was undeniable. Sarah glanced at Diaz. The corporal nodded faintly, still weak but alive. She allowed herself a momentary exhale. She had saved lives, restrained a threat, and secured evidence. But the battle for accountability wasn't over. Hargrove's influence ran deep, and she knew the fallout would be intense. She turned her gaze back to the bound general. "This ends today, Hargrove. Not with bullets, not with threats, but with proof, evidence, accountability. The rest is up to the system you've spent decades trying to manipulate." The general's eyes met hers, wide with rage and disbelief. His empire of fear and power had crumbled in the span of moments. He realized the truth. Courage, skill, and integrity could topple even the most untouchable figures. The desert air shimmered in the relentless sun, carrying dust, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of Hargrove's humiliation. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn crouched beside the bound general, the revolver in her hand steady, eyes scanning the canyon. Every grain of sand, every shadow, every movement of the soldiers surrounding them was under her scrutiny. She had secured the general, stabilized Dias, and documented the situation, but the next threat was less tangible. The eyes of the broader military were watching. Not literally at first, but the ripple effects of this unprecedented moment were already beginning to spread. Drones, radios, and the whispers of soldiers traveling up the chain of command meant that soon, the entire base would be aware of the confrontation in the desert canyon. Sarah's hands were steady, but her mind raced. General Hargrove had power, allies, and a network of loyalists who could try to manipulate events. Her plan had worked so far, but the real test would be in how the military establishment responded. Would her evidence be enough? Would those in command uphold justice, or side with the general's decades of influence? From the ridge above, Specialist Rivera, who had been filming the entire confrontation, approached carefully, phone still recording. "Lieutenant Quinn," he said, voice low, "we've got everything on tape. Drone footage, flare, stun device, the general struggling, all of it." Sarah gave a curt nod. "Good, make sure the files are backed up, multiple copies. Nobody can deny what happened here." Rivera's eyes flicked nervously toward the bound general, whose chest heaved with exhaustion and simmering rage. "Sir, he's furious," Rivera said quietly. "Even restrained, he's terrifying." Sarah allowed herself a small smirk. Terrifying when free. Now he's just a man who miscalculated. The canyon remained tense. Soldiers who had initially frozen began whispering among themselves. Some were loyal to Hargrove, some hesitant, but none dared intervene. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and the desert bore witness to an unprecedented reversal. Sarah's eyes flicked to Hargrove. The general's face was flushed, streaked with sweat and dust, his breath ragged. For the first time in decades, he was powerless, vulnerable, and dependent on those he had once dominated for survival. The arrogance that had carried him for years was now his cage. "Lieutenant," Hargrove rasped, voice quivering with fury, "you think this changes anything? You can't possibly." Sarah's gaze met his, unwavering. "I already have. You fired at me, attempted to take a life. And now every action, every word, every moment of your arrogance is documented." From the edge of the canyon, the faint hum of a helicopter began to rise. Sarah's heart leapt, not in fear, but in confirmation. Reinforcements. The investigative team and higher command had been dispatched, drawn to the escalating situation. She had maintained control long enough for official witnesses to arrive. The helicopter descended, kicking up dust that swirled around Sarah, the soldiers, and the bound general. Its rotor wash painted the desert in a whirlwind of sand, obscuring and revealing the scene in jagged flashes. Sarah shielded her eyes briefly, then adjusted her stance, ensuring that Hargrove remained restrained and visible to the approaching team. A senior officer emerged first from the helicopter, clipboard and radio in hand, scanning the scene rapidly. "Lieutenant Quinn," he called out, voice sharp, commanding. "Report." Sarah stood, lowering the revolver but keeping her stance firm, authoritative. "Sir, General Hargrove attempted lethal force against me. 5 shots fired. I restrained him using improvised methods. Evidence and witnesses are present. Drone footage capturing all movements. Backup requested and arriving. Situation contained, sir." The officer's eyes narrowed as he assessed the scene. The bound general, the flare-streaked canyon, the dust-streaked soldiers, and Sarah herself, steady, calm, and resolute in the chaos. He radioed briefly, then turned back to her. "Understood, Lieutenant. We'll take over containment and documentation. Good work maintaining control." Sarah exhaled, a fraction of relief passing through her. The immediate threat had been neutralized. The ripple effects, however, were only beginning. Hargrove's network would undoubtedly try to challenge her actions, to frame her as reckless or insubordinate. But with documented evidence, multiple witnesses, and the arrival of investigative authorities, she had built a nearly unassailable defense. The general, now silent for the first time since the confrontation began, glared at her, chest heaving, pride shattered. His fury was tempered by the stark reality of his situation. Sarah had turned the tables completely, proving that courage, intelligence, and preparation could outweigh authority rooted solely in fear. One of the arriving officers, a woman with a commanding presence, approached and glanced at Hargrove. "Sir," she said, voice firm, "you are being taken into custody for investigation. Your actions will be reviewed under Article 99 for attempted harm against personnel." Hargrove's face turned red, then pale. "You, he stammered, his voice barely audible. Sarah watched quietly, her expression neutral. She had no desire for vengeance. This wasn't personal. It was about accountability, survival, and demonstrating that even the most untouchable figures were subject to the rules they swore to uphold. As Hargrove was escorted to the helicopter under heavy supervision, Sarah finally allowed herself to lower her stance completely. She glanced at Diaz, who gave her a weak smile, grateful and relieved. The young corporal's survival had been her priority, and now the broader stakes, justice, accountability, and precedent, were secured. From the ridge, Rivera captured the entire process, the camera recording Sarah's composed presence as the investigative team took control. She had transformed from a medic into the pivotal figure in a moment that would ripple through military ranks for years. The sun continued its climb, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, highlighting the drama, the tension, and the resolution that had unfolded. Sarah's actions had rewritten the rules of engagement in a way no manual or doctrine could prepare for. Courage, preparation, and presence of mind had triumphed over arrogance and power. As the helicopter lifted off, taking Hargrove and the investigative team toward accountability, Sarah stood alone for a moment, the desert wind whipping around her, sand stinging her eyes. The scene of chaos was slowly returning to calm, but the lessons of the confrontation were indelible. Authority could be challenged, arrogance could be exposed, and a single individual, armed with courage and intellect, could alter the course of events entirely. Her comms crackled briefly. "Lieutenant Quinn," a voice said, "you handled the situation brilliantly. Reports are already circulating. The chain of command is impressed. Further instructions to follow." Sarah allowed herself a small, quiet smile. For now, she had survived, she had protected lives, and she had set a precedent that would echo far beyond the canyon. But she knew the world beyond the desert would not be quiet for long. Hargrove's allies would test the boundaries, question her methods, and perhaps even attempt retaliation. And yet she felt ready, calm, prepared. The desert had tested her courage, her skill, and her resolve, and she had passed. The helicopter disappeared into the distance, carrying General Thomas Hargrove and the investigative team toward an uncertain but inevitable reckoning. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn remained in the desert canyon, her boots crunching against the coarse sand as she surveyed the scene one last time. The flare's red glow had faded, leaving only the jagged shadows of the rocks and the faint dust trails marking the chaotic confrontation. Sarah exhaled, letting the tension ease from her shoulders, but only slightly. She had won the immediate battle, restrained a dangerous man, and secured undeniable evidence. Yet she knew the fight wasn't truly over. Hargrove's reach extended far beyond the canyon, and his network of loyal officers and influential allies could attempt to rewrite the narrative, discredit her actions, or even retaliate. Diaz shuffled over, leaning heavily on his uninjured leg. His eyes were wide with a mixture of awe, relief, and lingering fear. "Lieutenant, you actually did it," he murmured, his voice almost incredulous. "You restrained him. You stopped him." Sarah gave him a small nod. "Yes, but this isn't about me, Diaz. It's about accountability. We need to make sure the facts stay facts. That's the only way this works." Even as she spoke, her comms crackled. The investigative team's voice came through, calm but insistent. "Lieutenant Quinn, we've secured Hargrove. We're en route to the base for formal proceedings. Your cooperation will be requested as a primary witness. Please prepare statements and documentation." Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of relief. Everything she had done, the tactical restraint, the careful documentation, the use of the drone and flare, even the improvisation with zip ties, would now be scrutinized and validated. This was no longer just a desert showdown. It was a precedent, a story that would ripple through the chain of command and perhaps reshape military culture in subtle but lasting ways. But then came the shadow of doubt. Sarah knew Hargrove's influence was insidious. Years of networking, loyalty cultivation, and psychological manipulation could allow him to challenge her narrative. Even with overwhelming evidence, she had to remain vigilant. Back at the base, the first whispers had begun to circulate. Officers who had heard about the incident debated in hushed tones. A general restrained by a medic. Impossible. Unthinkable. Yet, corroborating reports and drone footage began to emerge. Sarah's actions were being verified piece by piece. Meanwhile, Hargrove, despite his physical restraint, was using every ounce of his charisma and power to frame the situation in his favor. He sent messages subtly to influential officers, attempting to sow doubt. "She overstepped," he wrote. "She disobeyed orders. Her actions are reckless. She is not to be trusted with command responsibilities." But Sarah had anticipated this. Multiple witnesses had captured the entire event. The drone footage provided indisputable evidence, and she had carefully documented each action, each movement, and each decision. When the base leadership reviewed the recordings, Hargrove's manipulations would crumble like sand slipping through fingers. Still, the tension was palpable. Sarah felt eyes on her everywhere she went. Subtle glances in the hallways, hushed whispers as she passed. Some officers admired her courage. Others resented the disruption she had caused in the rigid hierarchy. She understood both perspectives. Leadership was often defined by fear, obedience, and reputation. But today, she had challenged that, proving that courage, skill, and moral integrity mattered just as much. At night, in the quiet of her quarters, Sarah reviewed the footage again. Every angle of the canyon, every shot of Hargrove struggling against the zip ties, every glimpse of soldiers witnessing the confrontation, it all told the same story. A general had violated the very principles he swore to uphold, and a medic had taken decisive action to protect lives. Even as the evidence mounted in her favor, Sarah knew the public fallout would be intense. Social media, rumor, and gossip had a way of amplifying events beyond reason. By morning, there were already leaked messages circulating among the base. A medic restrained a general. Did this really happen? Lieutenant Quinn might be the bravest soldier alive, or reckless. Sarah ignored the chatter. She focused on preparation. Statements, logs, witness interviews, everything meticulously documented. This wasn't just self-preservation. It was about ensuring the truth remained untarnished. Then came the unexpected twist. An anonymous report reached her comms. Hargrove had a contingent of officers prepared to challenge the official narrative. They had access to communications, records, and, potentially, sympathetic voices in higher command. Sarah realized the next phase wasn't about brute force. It was about strategy, credibility, and moral authority. She called in Rivera and Diaz. "We have everything," she said quietly. "But he won't stop trying to manipulate events. We need to be prepared for hearings, inquiries, and personal attacks. They'll try to make me look reckless. They'll test everyone's loyalty." Diaz nodded. "Then we make sure no one can twist it. Everyone saw the truth. Everyone." Sarah took a deep breath. "Exactly. And we stay calm, precise, and truthful. That's the only way this works." Over the next 48 hours, the base was a flurry of activity. Investigators interviewed soldiers, reviewed drone footage, cross-checked reports, and ensured every detail was accounted for. The evidence against Hargrove was overwhelming. Witnesses corroborated Sarah's account. Every attempt at manipulation by the general was countered by documentation. Even Hargrove's loyal officers began to see the futility of resistance. His arrogance, which had once commanded obedience, was now a liability. The desert canyon had become legend in hours, a story retold in hushed tones across the base. Then came the moment Sarah had anticipated, the hearing. A panel of senior officers, investigators, and legal advisors convened. The room was tense, every eye on her as she recounted the events in the canyon, every detail precise, calm, and factual. Questions came fast, some probing, some skeptical, but she responded with clarity, integrity, and composure. Hargrove was present as well, his reputation now on display. He attempted to argue, to deflect, to manipulate perceptions, but the evidence was irrefutable. Drone footage, witness statements, and Sarah's detailed documentation left him with no avenue for falsehood. The arrogance that had defined him for decades was crumbling under the weight of truth. By the end of the hearing, it was clear. Accountability had prevailed. Hargrove's actions were classified as gross misconduct, endangering personnel, and attempted assault. Sarah's courage and strategic thinking had not only saved lives but ensured justice. Outside the hearing room, whispers of admiration followed her. Soldiers, young and old, looked at her with a new understanding. Hierarchy, they realized, did not automatically confer justice or morality. Integrity, skill, and courage mattered just as much. But even as victory seemed absolute, Sarah knew the world beyond the military bureaucracy would be watching. The story would leak, spread, and become legend. A tale of a medic who defied a general, restrained him, and changed the rules forever. The morning sun broke over the base like a spotlight, illuminating the tense faces of officers and soldiers assembled outside the hearing room. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn stood at the center, a figure of quiet strength. Dust from the desert still clung to her boots and uniform, a mark of the battle she had fought not just physically, but morally, strategically, and emotionally. Every fiber of her being had been tested over the past 72 hours. Inside the hearing room, the echoes of the confrontation in the desert canyon were still palpable. The evidence, the drone footage, witness testimonies, and Sarah's meticulous documentation was undeniable. General Thomas Hargrove had sat through the proceedings with a stoic mask, but every subtle tremor of his hand and every flicker of his eye betrayed the storm of humiliation and rage beneath the surface. The panel of senior officers, their faces grave and focused, reviewed the final footage once more. The canyon, once a silent battlefield, now existed as a testament to courage over authority, integrity over intimidation. They watched Sarah's calm, decisive actions, her tactical restraint of a man who had wielded fear like a weapon for decades. The lead officer, a colonel with decades of experience, leaned forward, his voice echoing in the room. "Lieutenant Quinn, your actions were extraordinary. You faced a direct threat from a commanding officer, and your response not only preserved lives but ensured accountability." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though a quiet sense of vindication rippled through her. "Thank you, sir. My priority was always the safety of personnel under my care. Everything else was secondary." Hargrove's gaze was a mix of fury and disbelief. "You overstepped. You humiliated me," he spat, his words sharp but hollow. "You don't understand the chain of command, the responsibilities of leadership." Sarah's voice remained steady, cold with authority. "Leadership is not power over others. Leadership is responsibility for them. You failed that responsibility the moment you fired at me." The panel exchanged glances. The evidence spoke for itself. The multiple witnesses corroborated every detail. Hargrove's attempts to manipulate the narrative were transparent, and the drone footage left no room for doubt. After a tense pause, the colonel spoke again. "General Hargrove, your actions constitute gross misconduct, reckless endangerment, and violation of multiple protocols regarding the treatment of personnel. You are relieved of command, pending further investigation and potential judicial proceedings." The words struck like a thunderclap. Hargrove's jaw tightened, a storm of fury and disbelief flashing across his face. For decades, he had wielded fear as a tool of control, never imagining that someone so seemingly insignificant, a medic, a lieutenant, could dismantle his authority so completely. Sarah exhaled quietly. The immediate battle was over. The desert showdown had ended, not in bullets but in justice, and justice, she realized, had its own power. Outside, the assembled soldiers and officers were whispering in awe. News of the verdict spread quickly, reaching every corner of the base. Some soldiers approached Sarah with respect, others with admiration, and a few with reluctant acceptance. The desert canyon had rewritten the rules of authority in a way no one could ignore. Diaz, the young corporal whose life she had saved, approached cautiously. "Lieutenant, I don't even know what to say," he stammered, eyes wide with gratitude. You saved all of us, and you didn't even hesitate." Sarah gave him a faint smile, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We all did our part, Diaz. Courage isn't just one person, it's everyone who stands with integrity." Even Hargrove, escorted out by military police, cast a long, bitter glance at her. His network of influence, built over decades, was fractured in hours. His reputation was shattered. The desert canyon had exposed a truth no amount of authority or manipulation could erase. Courage, preparation, and integrity could outmatch arrogance and fear. As the days passed, the story of Sarah Quinn spread beyond the base. Reports circulated through official channels, then leaked to social media, military blogs, and forums. Headlines praised the young medic who had restrained a general. "Courage in the desert. Medic defies power, Lieutenant Quinn. A new standard of leadership. When accountability triumphs over arrogance." The story wasn't just about Sarah's heroism. It was about a profound shift in perspective. Soldiers began to question blind obedience, to evaluate the true meaning of leadership. Her actions had sparked discussions, debates, and reflections across ranks. Authority, they realized, was not automatic. It was earned through responsibility and moral courage. Sarah herself remained grounded. The attention was overwhelming at times, but she focused on the mission, the personnel under her care, and the integrity of her actions. She spent hours documenting her experience, ensuring that every lesson, every tactical decision, and every emotional challenge was preserved for training and history. Then came a quiet, pivotal moment. Alone on the base balcony, Sarah watched the desert horizon, the canyon still visible in the distance. The sun painted the rocks gold and crimson, a symbol of struggle, triumph, and endurance. The wind whispered through the sand, carrying with it a sense of finality and possibility. She allowed herself to reflect. The desert had tested her courage, resilience, and intellect. She had faced an unstoppable arrogance head-on and emerged victorious, not through brute force alone, but through preparation, skill, and unwavering moral clarity. And yet, she knew the story wasn't just hers. It belonged to every soldier who had witnessed the confrontation, every person who had relied on integrity over fear, and every individual who now understood that power without responsibility was a fragile illusion. The final reckoning came when Hargrove's network, previously loyal officers, realized that resistance was futile. With the evidence irrefutable, even his staunchest allies could not challenge the outcome. The general's influence waned, and the Desert Canyon incident became a cornerstone case study in accountability, leadership, and courage. Sarah's own recognition was quiet but profound. Awards, commendations, and formal acknowledgement followed, not as vanity, but as affirmation of a principle. Courage paired with integrity could triumph over the most entrenched arrogance. On the final day of hearings, the colonel addressed her directly. "Lieutenant Quinn, your actions have set a precedent. Not only did you save lives, but you reminded us all what leadership truly means. The military owes you a debt of gratitude." She nodded, emotion flickering briefly in her eyes. "Thank you, sir. I only did what anyone should have. Leadership isn't about fear, it's about responsibility." Outside the courthouse, journalists, soldiers, and civilians gathered, eager to hear the story. Sarah remained composed as she recounted the events, emphasizing courage, preparation, and accountability. Each word reinforced a narrative far larger than herself, a story that would resonate for generations. The desert canyon, once a silent battlefield, had become legendary. Lieutenant Sarah Quinn, the medic who defied a general, restrained him with nothing but skill, intelligence, and courage, and ensured justice prevailed, had redefined what it meant to stand up in the face of arrogance. As she stood beneath the blazing sun, the wind sweeping dust across the ground, Sarah knew that her life, and the lives of those she had protected, would never be the same. She had faced fear, defied authority, and emerged not just alive but triumphant.